It's really a pleasure to be here. What I'll be speaking on today is really at its core how much Paulo Freire's work has impacted my own pedagogy. I was first introduced to his philosophy, to his approach to education through my own undergrad mentor, who I'm still in deep relationship and mentorship with, which I think speaks to the power of how much Freirean pedagogies can actually transform our relationship with our students. What I'll be doing through today's presentation is, as mentioned in the session description, giving an insight into sort of how we can develop non or anti-hierarchical learning environments. And I'll be doing that first through kind of giving a foundation of pedagogy, various pedagogical foundations, how those manifest in academia. But the bulk of our time together today, I'll actually be offering 3 different case studies through how I've tried to do this in my own instruction. And then hopefully we can also have some conversations about what feels relevant to you all, what you hope to sort of bring back to your own classrooms. I'd love to hear kind of ideas from all of you as well about how we can sort of cultivate these more collectivist, liberation-centered learning environments. So I first want to talk about this really important question about education for whom and by what means. I think often, particularly in mainstream conversations, we view education obviously as a very important and liberatory opportunity in and of itself. However, a lot of scholars of sociology, my own discipline, as well as higher education broadly, have talked about how we also need to be intentional around what our approaches to education philosophy actually are. So Sandy Grande in her book, important book, Red Pedagogy, the original and the 10th anniversary edition, talk about how academia at its core tends to recreate societal inequities through pedagogies that focus on hierarchy, right? So we can think about this as the sort of typical teacher-student relationship where the teacher is the master or the kind of focus of the classroom, and they are simply passing on information for the student to regurgitate. We'll get back to that point later because that's really core to what Paulo Freire is disrupting. The other really crucial philosophy that kind of guides this work is that of Sada Ahmed. She has a really important article from 2007, which talks about the language of diversity. I'm actually talking about this with my graduate students in our summer course right now, but Ahmed's work really critiques the sort of bureaucratic measures that the university often takes up. These processes that seem to create equity or kind of create equitable circumstances usually are just bureaucratic measures that are actually absent of any tangible means of reparations or creating equity in the classroom. And so I'll get to this in one of my case studies, but the fact that even accessibility procedures within the university often create more barriers for students who actually need access to the classroom in different ways. So what are ways that we can move away from sort of the bureaucracy of higher education and actually move towards focusing on producing a learning-centered environment for all? Finally, the last component here, more so relevant to my research, but I think it's important to think about the historical circumstances of institutions, particularly as a sociologist, is that the origins of the university were that it was actually the intellectual arm of the empire. So it has a key role in producing colonialism and colonial empires. But today, such as in books like the 2018 Decolonizing the University, a lot of scholars and activists and students are actually thinking about how can we transform the university as a place for radical societal change. We've seen this as recent as with the encampments against the genocide in Palestine across university campuses, that we know the university is a site for radical societal transformational change. So how can we actually cultivate that within our classroom spaces? So Freire talks about these relationships of learning through a concept he calls banking education. What banking education does is essentially ensures that students do not recognize their innate power for creativity, inquiry, and theorizing. This political or cartoon I think really funnily sort of indicates that, the student asking, why do we need to know this? It's on your final exam, right? So this notion that students are not actually creating knowledge, they're not being encouraged to feel empowerment over their knowledge production or even produce knowledge, period, but actually sort of just regurgitate material that is offered to them in the course. What this does is that it mirrors oppressive social norms by initiating youth into a power dynamic that's represented as normal. Again, throughout education in the US, starting from grade school through higher education, it's this notion that the instructor is the master of knowledge. The student is simply the bank, right, where the knowledge is being put into, and they simply need to regurgitate the material. So again, the education is a standard canon to be regurgitated rather than a sort of process of reflection and action or praxis of intellect to be discovered. Freire really beautifully puts this in his key text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where a lot of this theory comes from. Quote, the more students work at storing the deposits entrusted to them, the less they develop the critical consciousness which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of that world. The more completely they accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend to simply adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in them. So you can see his sort of play on words with this banking education model that it truly sees students as a bank within which we are to put normative or hegemonic knowledge of the world, which results in having a very fragmented view of reality instead of the more nuanced understanding of our social and political relations that we can develop if we sort of cultivate a collective learning environment. So I think the real question that I want to pose here is, what do we gain when we view classroom spaces as actually anti-elitist and non-hierarchical possibilities? And going back to Freire's question, he focuses on students becoming transformers of that world, but I actually want to take his work a step further and think about, what and who is actually transformed by switching from this kind of top typical model of education. Again, we can even see structurally how we maintain this banking education model with the teacher at the front of the classroom, everyone sort of lecture seating, versus a more sort of collective, cultivate this kind of collectivist joint learning model. What and who is transformed when we move from this top version to the bottom version? So I actually want to hear a bit from all of you through this Mentimeter. And if you haven't used Mentimeter before, there's a few options for joining. One of them, I will drop a link in the chat. You can also, on any other device, go to menti.com and use this code. It will prompt you for the code, or you can also use this QR code if you have a device that allows you to scan the QR code. So I'll drop this in the chat, but before I get to the case studies, I would love to hear, obviously you all, we're interested in this topic because you joined today. So I'd love to hear, what does a non-hierarchical classroom feel like to you, sound like to you, look like to you? So as you all engage, this will kind of develop a word cloud of everyone's thoughts. Wow, thank you so much. This is so rich and engaged already. As you all can see, collaborative is our top word here. But I love that there's really no other sort of commonality actually between a lot of what you all are sharing. We have no desks. I love that kind of tangible, very physical notion of what the non-hierarchical classroom looks like. Student-centered, balanced, synergy, solidarity, team-based learning, reciprocal, all voices shared. Really, really wonderful. I'll give folks another minute or two to kind of jump in here. Thanks, Sam, for that first comment in the Q&A about kind of the shifting social political dimensions of the university. I think we'll come back to that later, but yeah, just a quick reminder to keep throwing those questions in the Q&A. Awesome. So this is going to stay live on your devices. I'm going to transition now into some of our case studies. And maybe if any of those prompt further reflection about what the non-hierarchical classroom feels, looks, or sounds like to you, would love folks to keep dropping this in here. The link will stay live with the results, and that's something that can be shared out to you all after as well. So the first case study is born out of COVID learning dynamics, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And it comes from the sort of lesson here is how do we learn together through decreased capacity? So I think, again, language that is probably familiar to all of you, especially those of you who are educating during COVID, and especially the fully virtual early days of COVID, that we quickly acknowledged that, students have decreased capacity as well as ourselves during these new conditions of learning. I think we have quickly forgotten also that decreased capacity is maybe more of a norm than we acknowledge. So I think my hope here is with non-hierarchical education, we can think about how can we always acknowledge that folks are operating perhaps at decreased capacities at all times. This is something particularly as I have moved to fully online asynchronous education through ASU Online. It's something that I'm constantly thinking about of folks who are participating in such a program usually are constantly engaging multiple demands, as am I. And so what are ways that I can facilitate a classroom that allows students to show up in the ways that they're able to at that moment without sort of penalizing or creating a punitive environment where if you didn't read, I don't want you here, or if you didn't read, I don't want you to speak, right? So how can we kind of move beyond that and actually think about there are multiple ways that folks can engage that actually enrich the classroom rather than create a value judgment based on how people are showing up. So one possibility for this, and quick primer, I guess, for this case study section is that I'll kind of give an overview of what I did, and then I'll actually show some visual examples as well. So one thing that I did particularly, I think this was something I did even pre-COVID, but I sort of ramped it up during COVID, was introducing materials for engagement in the live course session itself that paralleled reading materials. So, at that time I was teaching online synchronously. And so when we would actually meet for session, I would sort of bring in parallel materials like movie or TV clips, song lyrics, poetry that I found offered students an en route to engage with the written material for multiple reasons, right? Either if they logistically actually didn't get to read, or if they read and it wasn't super accessible for them, right? So showing them kind of different ways to engage with the material. From my English background, a skill that I found really useful that I have brought into sociology and sociological classrooms is doing close readings, right? So close reading is usually something we just do in English classes, but texts like Weber, like Marx, can certainly benefit from close reading. And I think students really enjoyed that experience of doing close reading together. So finding a passage that I found, if students just took this passage away and really deeply understood it, it would be useful to their comprehension, and putting it on the screen and then perhaps in subsequent screens, color coding various points as we analyze them to kind of generate knowledge around what lessons are we taking away from this passage. And again, that was something I sometimes did myself, or I asked students to raise particular passages on their own, either in the session or beforehand, as they got more comfortable with that approach. Another option was sort of small group application or an expansion exercise on the reading. So what this often looked like was doing a deep dive into research on the region, subjects, or areas being brought up, and what is being done currently on said issues. So particularly during weeks on sociology of immigration, we would perhaps explore more about what the immigration policies were in relation to that country or that region, look at what certain organizations were doing to facilitate some of the issues there. And that really offered students that applied opportunity to engage with the material in a way that was offering them new content in the session itself. So these are some quick visual examples of point number one here, the song lyrics, or excuse me, the poetry actually example. So during the class, played an audio clip from Carlina Duan, who's a Chinese American poet who actually writes on issues of Chinese American exclusion, which that week they had been looking at readings around the Page Act of 1875, because the actually Atlanta spa shootings had just happened that week. And so we sort of moved in the class, in the sociology violence class, to specifically talk about the violence we were actively witnessing. And in Duan's poem, she talks about historical Chinese exclusion. She actually engages archival documents around Chinese exclusion. And so what even hearing this poem did was teach students how they can engage with archival resources in a creative way. It allowed them sort of audio and visual content in the class itself to engage with the learning materials, to perhaps engage with a difficult subject in a nuanced way that they had not been able to before. And again, it sort of just offered different sites for interaction that perhaps would not have been possible if they either didn't have capacity to do the reading, if they were feeling too overwhelmed by current events to do the reading. It also offered sort of a both historical and contemporary moments of connection, showing that how are these moments both rooted in history that is really important to contextualize this moment, but also how can we engage with that history in the present in creative, nuanced ways as they were witnessing through the poem. So this actually generated a lot of engagement, both in the chat, verbally. Folks are really kind of intrigued by the option of using poetry to engage with history, to engage with sociology. So that ended up being a really exciting opportunity. I also used a lot of Patriot Act with Hassan Minhaj. That was also really popular and still continues to be popular. I use clips from him often when we're going into contemporary issues because he covered so many in the various series, seasons of his show. So bringing in some of those kind of pop culture, multimedia content to really, again, generate that curious engagement around content that might already be familiar to them in different ways. So the next case study is going to think about rejecting mastery and accepting nuance. So this gets a bit back into what I was talking about with Freire, that he's sort of through rejecting banking education is also rejecting this notion that being a teacher, being an educator is about mastery. It's about holding knowledge production in one space. Instead, how do we sort of accept nuance, both in terms of rejecting hierarchy, not accepting that the educator or the instructor at the front of the room is kind of the only person who has a holistic understanding of the topic at hand, but also rejecting that only a person from a particular social identity can engage with X topic. So I'll get into that in a bit. So what this case study actually came out of was honestly my own insecurities as an instructor. And I, went straight into my PhD from undergrad. And particularly institution like UCLA, which thankfully facilitates folks doing their bachelor's at various stages in life. I was finding myself in an instructor role where many of my students were older than me. I also, as mentioned in my bio, did not do sociology in undergrad. And so I was doing sociology for the first time as a PhD student, where I was also being required to then teach sociology. And so while grappling with my own anxieties and insecurities about being an instructor of a topic or a discipline I felt I had very little understanding of, I started to think about returning to Freire and thinking about how could I actually use this to develop a pedagogy that did not rely on mastery or sort of being in charge of the classroom in a way that is pretty typical in academia, but actually modeling for students that, learning is a lifelong process. We can learn together, and actually engaging with that in front of them. So that's something that that I was able to do in this case study, which I'll show you on the next slide. So again, some of the questions prompting that for me were, how can we learn together, and what does each person offer to the learning space? On that second question in particular, and this was the question I posed earlier of, how can folks from various social identities engage with topics? Something that I have found in recent years, particularly as we kind of have more discussions around social identities and political power, is that it often forecloses the participation of students or even people on topics if they feel that they are in a position of power in relation to that. So what I mean by that is, right, the kind of typical gut response of, well, if you're white, then you should be quiet and not talk during this class on race. Or if you're a man, then if we're talking about patriarchy, you just sort of have to sit and listen. While I certainly believe there is value to listening and hearing other people's experiences, I really struggled with this notion that, again, we were, kind of foreclosing particular experiences of a social political dynamic that we all experience. So what I try to convey to my students, which is very much inspired by, scholars like Barbara Fields, who talk about, race is not something that is predetermined. It's something that we actively create, that racism came first. It's sort of, we needed a way to justify the hierarchies of social difference. And so these categories were created. And so what I try to do is remind students that, um, you know, white supremacy or patriarchy or capitalism, these are all social political dynamics that we are all experiencing. Yes, some of us may gain power through some of them. Some of us may be marginalized or experience violence because of them. But at the end of the day, these social political dynamics are dehumanizing to all of us because they place us in particular categories of social and political identity. And so if we actually encourage everyone to speak to our understandings of, for example, white supremacism from the positionality from which we have experienced that, that actually enriches our discussion, right? It doesn't sort of close off that only X people can speak on a dynamic, but by encouraging everyone to participate, we actually gain a more nuanced understanding of that topic. So I'm going to return though for my case study. That's something that I sort of just cultivated in classroom discussions. What I want to offer as my example here is, how I walked students through the learning process. So we had one course, one week of the class was focused on symbolic violence, in which we covered Charles Tilley's War Making and State Making as Organized Crime. What was really useful for me there is that Tilley actually has a graphic in his article that circulates with his theories around state making and statecraft. And so, but obviously at first glance, this is also not a super accessible graphic. So what we did in the course was we actually, one slide, I just threw this up on the screen, and the screen was one of those where you're projecting on a whiteboard. And so we kind of just sat with the graph and really deconstructed it, thought of examples of what does extraction look like from the state? What does war making look like from the state? Protection, state making, which institutions, entities, which social and political actors are actually carrying out these procedures, and really just truly broke down the graph together collectively and used it as an active learning experience as a way to engage with the article. Once we had done that, we then returned to the text, and they were able to, now having those contemporary examples of what state making looks like, engage with the material in a much more enriched way. Bourdieu, those of you who have read, especially his work, article, What Makes a Social Class, very dense work, something that I was frank with them that I struggled to even understand myself. And so I actually developed this graphic in creating my own understanding of what Bourdieu's argument about a social class was, using the various kind of terminologies and theories that he was putting forth. And then in the class itself, we actually broke down my graphic about how I constructed my understanding of social space through Bourdieu's argument. And then I actually had them also develop their own visual graphics for how they could understand this dense sociological theory. So again, two examples here of kind of rejecting mastery, accepting nuance, and also developing that collective learning space together. So last case study here, and then I have another kind of question for you all, and we'll get into some of that Q&A, is focusing on learning over achievement. So this one is really crucial, and it's something that I think I'm grappling with the most in terms of figuring out how this actually works effectively in the classroom, right? Because achievement is something that the university at large, higher education at large, really focuses on. And one of the ways that I try and do this is using strategies like ungrading that, the creators of are speaking about at this conference, which is really exciting. But I, it's really interesting to use a process like ungrading or self-grading because, again, like I mentioned, at the end of the day, still have to submit grades to the roster, to the registrar. I find that there's many pros and cons as well. For example, students are more likely to be harsher on themselves if they come from, for example, a first-gen background. Women of color tend to be harsher on themselves compared to their efforts in the class. And similarly, students who come from perhaps environments where they feel more comfortable with education or they feel more empowered in society tend to be more generous with how they grade themselves. So these are things that I talk about with my students and I'm forthcoming about, but it's still something that I struggle with of, is ungrading a process that is simply reifying social and political hierarchies, or is this something that's allowing us to disrupt them? The main benefit, though, that I see is that it allows overall progress to be tracked based on an individual or unique starting point. I've had so many students tell me throughout the course, at the end of the course, that their experience and being told to focus on learning over achievement has allowed them to engage with really dense texts that they normally would have had too much anxiety to focus on, that they have been able to push past their test anxiety, being told to, just aim for above 70%, that is the mark of comprehension versus going for an A, 95%, right? And so I think this has been really transformative for students and for myself to think about what are we actually focusing on in the classroom? How do we move away from achieving a particular goal, which is marked by the entirety of the class, and more so focusing on, hey, what is my comprehension? What is my experience with this material coming into the class? And have I progressed beyond that after 6 weeks, after 7.5 weeks? What does it look like for my own learning trajectory and my own experience? I think another exciting thing here is, when it's possible, because ASU Online does have pretty tight turnarounds. So particularly with ungrading, students are graded on a complete, incomplete basis. And so with that, in the more extended terms, I do allow opportunities to rewrite after offering resources and feedback to the student. The unique thing here, which kind of gets into my own focus areas as a sociology instructor, is that for me, I think while writing and being able to critically read and write is an important skill that I believe all students should take away from their university experience, doing it in one class is not realistic, particularly one that isn't actually focused on teaching them those skills. And so I really sit down with my learning objectives and think, if I'm not truly teaching them how to read and write better in this course, I should not be significantly marking them down if that's something that they're struggling with. And so this is something that also requires developing a strong relationship amongst the instructional team, right? So working with my TAs, working with my graders of, hey, if it feels like there are language barriers here, if it feels like there are skills that need to be developed, but the student clearly comprehends the material and is explaining that in a way that you can understand, that is what our priority should be, because that's what our learning objectives are in this course. So again, learning over achievement. And again, offering that kind of application-based or community-oriented material to sort of recalibrate learning outside of academia. So often, if folks are sort of just stuck in that academic bubble, focusing on, what learning looks like in this space, it's really hard to get teeth into what I'm saying here about learning over achievement. So in all of my courses, I really try to incorporate, if not multiple small projects, at least one large project that gets students out of the classroom, out of the, just learning in that sort of Canvas space and getting into the community, interacting with people outside of higher education, outside of academia, to really think about the materials they're working on. So my social inequalities and social change classes, I have them develop, either social media posts or a day in the life YouTube blog where they sort of go around talking to their loved ones, talking to folks on campus, wherever they are, interviewing people from a local organization, grassroots or nonprofit, about the topics in the course, and having those really applied one-on-one conversations enriches their understanding, and it also allows them to apply the material and retain the material in a way that connects with their lived experience and will actually translate to outside of the course instead of just focusing on the text as the text. And it also reminds them what is actually relevant in their real world instead of what is just relevant to their exam for Soc 352, for example. I also really try and offer alternative assignments and extended deadlines. So I did mention this at the beginning of the presentation, but just in 2 years of being at ASU, I think it has been really enlightening to see that while we have come a long way in terms of offering accommodations around various approaches and needs for learning, there are still a lot of needs students have that are not able to be accommodated, that the university does not accommodate because, as Ahmed talked about, the university's mode of inclusion operates through documentation, right? So if a student has an approach to learning that cannot be documented by a medical professional or some sort of professional generally, they usually can't get the accommodations they need. So, again, all of this is ongoing for me, and it's things that I adapt and cultivate from term to term. But some of the things I've started to do, which again are not unique to me, a lot of these are common practice, but not just offering extended deadlines if I get a message from student accommodations, but offering a just blanket 48-hour grace period for all assignments. Usually what that means, particularly given the fast pace of ASU terms, is that I really rarely offer extensions, if at all, outside of that. So all assignments, except for the final day of class, have a blanket 48-hour, no questions asked buffer period, get it in by that date, no penalties. And so then that kind of offers a level of comfort for all students, whether or not they're able to get that formal accommodation, whether or not life happens, it's just there. I've also tried to start doing alternative assignments and being more open to that to the extent possible, right? So, and I'm pretty clear with students that my capacity is different during the school year than it is during summer term. So right now in summer, I have 150 students versus in spring, I had 600. So the amount of sort of catering to various learning styles is going to be different depending on the term. Part of this is also kind of disrupting the bureaucracy of education, that I'm very transparent with students about what my capacity is and how I can support them. But for example, this term, I have a student who, as I've had in the past, that quizzes really just does not click with their learning style. And so I've been having, however, they're a very gifted writer. They actually have a blog on their own. So I've been having them do an op-ed style piece for every module to engage with the material and connect it to contemporary world issues. And I've found that her certainly anxiety around the course has significantly decreased, but her ability to convey her comprehension of the material has truly exponentially increased as we've progressed through the course. The last thing I'll quickly show here is, for my current course right now, my graduate course, this is an example for that. Ungrading or self-grading, this is the final grade criteria that they're given on their final self-assessment they'll be completing next week. So, this this might feel vague, but I think the idea is, again, to offer generosity in terms of the effort folks feel that they have put in and the growth they feel they've had. There are qualitative components of the assessment as well, where they are asked to anecdotally explain that and go through that with me. But some of the criteria, the main one is sort of, let's see. Yeah. So, offering space for growth. So for an A, out of 6 modules by module 3, all work is receiving complete. For earning a B by module 4 or 5, they're earning completes. And then after this, for a C, it was sort of by the end of the course by module 6, right? So offering that space for trajectory of growth according to each person's kind of learning experience in the course. So while I hop into the chat and the Q&A, I did want to offer a new prompt that I'd love to hear from folks about. Actually, sorry, I'm going to go back to this real quick. So a lot of what I was mentioning here really reflect my own priorities as an instructor. And I think so often because we are trying to meet benchmarks or we are trying to sort of have metrics that we can display for our annual reviews, we don't have time to kind of pause and think about what are my own priorities as an instructor? What do I actually want students to take away? And I know often we do this through things like learning objectives, but I think part of developing our pedagogy and thinking about what does developing a pedagogy that feels reflective of my social and political commitments, what that looks like, is really recalibrating around this question of, yeah, what do I want to prioritize? So I'd love to hear from folks. You'll be able to offer your response here on the same device you had your Mentimeter open on. You can also access it again through the link. And as folks respond, you can also upvote people's responses if you resonate with yeah, with what folks have shared. So while you do that, I'm going to hop into this chat. I totally agree, Tara, that mastery also, yes, implies a finite learning point rather than inspires the idea of lifelong learning. Awesome. Yes, love these ideas, Jackie. Jackie said the need for alternative assessments if comprehension is the goal, create audio podcasts, videos, art pieces, etc. Totally. I would really, as an avid podcast fan, I'm still figuring out how to realistically incorporate that into asynchronous education. Um, but yeah, I love that. I think it's thankfully becoming more and more common. Hi, everyone. Sorry, we lost power.
Welcome
That's
back.
wild. That hasn't happened. Of course, it happens right now. Um, okay. I think, thank you so much. I was sad I wasn't gonna be able to get back on, but power up the hotspot. So shout out to that. I'm gonna throw the Mentimeter back up. I'm trying to see. Okay, awesome. I think I lost the chat unfortunately, but I still have the Q&A. So let's see. So I unfortunately I don't consider myself an AI expert, so I'm going to skip the questions on AI. I think we have, including our wonderful keynote that happened this morning, a lot of folks who are experts in that category who can speak to that. So I would encourage you to check out Professor Benjamin's keynote that happened this morning, as well as the many other folks who are speaking on AI. What I will address is, you know, so I think Sam's question is important in terms of thinking about how do we kind of navigate some of these priorities as we are struggling with sort of the dynamics of shifting higher education and the US political landscape overall. Um, I think what I've found, and I'll be frank, that my, approach is very much guided by my own tradition, my faith, and kind of my life philosophy that so long as I'm meant to be in a space, I will be there. And so I will acknowledge that to the extent that is humanly possible, I think I try to void myself of the anxieties around being in a non-tenure eligible position, possibilities of losing my position, which are very real given how much I disrupt the kind of norms of the university. What I think about is that so long as I'm in this role and have the opportunity to be in this space, how can I support as many students as possible? How can I kind of create this bubble of opportunity for my students? And I think so much of that is also a reflective of the few professors I had who did that for me, right? And so my hope is that by creating that chance for engagement with my students, they will see that that possibility is there, right? So I think to your question, Sam, it's really, I think I don't concern myself with how can I transform the university dynamics overall, but how can I show my students enough possibilities around liberatory pedagogies that they know that that possibility exists and that it is real, and it is something that either they can cultivate themselves or that they can experience again in another space. So yeah, just really focusing on my own one classroom and how much I can do there. Yeah, Matthew, I love, seeing that the project-based learning was really effective for you. I think at the higher education level, it's interesting. I feel like I have to do a lot of sort of contextualizing, because if I say, it feels like all college and especially graduate level students are allergic to the word group project. They get ready to bite as soon as I say that. So, but I do agree. I think once they sort of being clear about those learning objectives, really focusing on why are we doing this, making my pedagogical approaches clear, I think all of that really helps. And I usually try and do it in the lecture itself as well, so that they're being reminded of that every single module. Let's see here. So many awesome questions. There's a question about racecraft, which I'm going to sort of type this in here. Barbara Fields has a book, Racecraft, with her sister, as well as The Ideology of Race, I believe it's called, in the New Left Review. So I'm typing that in the Q&A. See. Collective note-taking doc is great. I'd be curious, Cade, I think, apologies if I mispronounced that. I think it's interesting with the collective documenting. I've done that in various settings. I think with the huge asynchronous classes, sometimes folks don't get a chance to build that relationship, and so they feel a bit uncertain about sort of doing those sort of collective resource building. But it's something that I've tried out with, for example, doing shared study guides where they're all kind of collaborating on that. Katie, great question. I think for the sake of time, what I'm going to throw up here actually is my contact info. I know, I'm sorry we lost a few minutes there. I definitely did not get to everyone. So I'm hoping folks can maybe email me or just connect in general. My I guess final takeaway I wanted to offer is that non-hierarchical and collectivist pedagogies are primarily concerned with learning as a process rather than achievement as an outcome. I think if you take one thing away from this talk, that's what I hope you can focus on. Here you'll find this QR code goes to my website, which is also listed below. You can contact me through there or through my personal email here. Yeah, please, if I didn't get to your question, I would love to be in conversation also, because I'm sure I can learn so many strategies from you. I saw a lot of great ideas in the chat, so I would love to hear more and be in collaboration with all of you. Thank you so much. It's been such an honor.